The aircraft carriers were out of action with them, so was air cover anywhere west of Ceylon. There were 5 Japanese aircraft carriers, 2 fleet and 3 light, believed to still be operational in the battle space, but now more than ever, there was no time to allow the Japanese any breathing room to get their forces across the Indian Ocean. Force A, headed by HMS Warspite, was sailing right into the thick of enemy-held territory to destroy whatever shipping they could find. Ladies, gents, and everybody in between, welcome back to the Indian Ocean campaign. Force A and Force B had been moved from their patrol positions east of Trincomalee, south of Calcutta respectively, and were chugging along at all ahead full towards the Andaman Sea. Without the rescue planes carried aboard HMS Formidable, the forces were reliant on their own scout planes to surge ahead, but just short of Nicobar Islands, one of Warspite's walruses spotted the convoy tracking south. The chase was on. Force A maintained sight of the enemy, and despite losing most of its scout aircraft as a result, made contact at 1600 on the 24th of April. And even with carrier fighters buzzing overhead, the allied vessels, 4 destroyers, a light cruiser and a battleship, charged into battle. Having learnt a lesson from the engagement that had sent HMS Napier and Nestor into dry dock, the leading destroyers were offsetting their course instead of setting a straight course for the enemy, but the same issue of being unable to maintain firing solutions in poor weather was still in effect. But every once in a while, Warspite's main battery boomed at the only ship that could be seen from a distance, a Megami-class heavy cruiser. Crossing within 9,000 yards, the 2 foremost destroyers, Hotspur and Nizam, were taking hits from opposing destroyers. Warspite and Megami were exchanging fire on the other side of the proverbial field. This particular fight was so massively one-sided, it's not even funny. So, while Warspite laid a beatdown on her prey, Newcastle and the destroyers popped open the transport. The convoy's escort struck back, hitting Hotspur several times amidships and lighting her on fire something fierce. To the east, the Australian destroyers were flanking a random Japanese formation whilst laying hell into its transports. As the battle progressed, Newcastle shifted her fire from the transports and onto the Megami to convince her to sink quicker, as the heavy cruiser's secondary battery was causing significant damage to the allied destroyers, even while she was getting torn to pieces by Warspite. As the transport sank, Hotspur was forced to retreat to deal with damage control efforts, HMS Griffin taking her place while Megami, fatally damaged by 6 and 15-inch shells, rolled over and sank. Thus, the battleship's next target became the next biggest warship in the Japanese line, a Tenryu-class light cruiser. It took a couple of salvos to get the range dialed in, but when Warspite found a mark... With the convoy escort screen decimated, all that was left to do was for Force A to dispose of the transports. And with the convoy's destruction, Warspite and her company withdrew west out of the battle space under the cover of darkness, while Force B entered the Andaman Sea and conducted fruitless patrols. Elsewhere, late on the 25th of April, the Dutch transport New Holland had just unloaded reinforcements at Kolkata and was on her way out when the base was attacked by Japanese bombers. These bombers spotted New Holland, plus a detached element from Force F, the cruiser HMS Birmingham and destroyer HMS Foxhound, and elected to attack them instead. Fortunately, a squadron of Hurricanes from the Indian Air Force was stationed nearby and blunted the attack before it could cause any harm. That night, Force B made a high-speed run through the Andaman Sea and past Port Blair searching for enemy shipping. Alas, not having found anything before daylight, Force B continued south until reaching the Nicobar Islands and headed back west towards the friendly side of the ocean, its search having proved fruitless. Up at Calcutta, the base was attacked once more, this time by G4 and Betty bombers, and one more time the Indian Hurricanes stationed there protected Force F from attack. A day later, and the attacks kept coming, but the Hurricanes kept defending. On the 28th of April though, things sharply got more interesting when a Japanese fighter was spotted on radar observing the main body of Force F. And given the distance from Japanese airfields, there was a Japanese task force somewhere close by. As it turned out, very close by, because to Force F's south, said Japanese task force appeared right off the coast at the seaplane base at Kolkata. Both ships in the force, the heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire and destroyer HMS Express, immediately raced southwards to intercept the enemy, but it was too late to do anything about landings. A large Japanese army, roughly of brigade size, had landed on the Indian soil. Almost immediately, Force B and elements of Force A were directed towards Kolkata, but the only elements in place to make the intercept were the two ships in the main body of Force F. And at 9:30 am on the 28th, Dorsetshire and Express made contact with a Japanese convoy centered on the ancient aircraft carrier IGN Hosho, escorted by a multitude of destroyers and the last of the former Gami-class cruisers. Both allied ships turned to engage, but Dorsetshire was immediately forced on the defensive to avoid attacks from a squadron of 9 torpedo bombers, torpedoes cutting so close that one could have reached out and touched them from the main deck. In spite of being hideously outnumbered and considerably outgunned, the two vessels opened fire on Hosho, attempted to scratch another carrier from the Japanese fleet before withdrawing. Express received a number of hits from Japanese destroyers, but in exchange for this, Dorsetshire struck the carrier with a handful of 8-inch shells and set her on fire. Express loosed off her torpedoes in the general direction of the enemy. Dorsetshire continued to lay absolute hell on the carrier, and before long, Hosho had slowed to a crawl with widespread fires breaking out all across the ship. Dorsetshire loosed off her torpedoes into the congregation of Japanese shipping, but before any of these torpedoes could hit anything, one of her 8-inch shells slid into Hosho's forward bomb magazine. The resulting explosion shattered the carrier. With morale on the uprise as a result of having destroyed Hosho, Force F continued the offensive and were rewarded for their troubles when, within a minute of the carrier sinking, Dorsetshire's 8-inch main battery found the forward magazine of the Megami, ripping off her bow forward of the bridge and destroying her foremost main guns. In exchange for touching off 2 magazines in a row, Force F was almost hit with the confidence killer when a salvo of long-lance torpedoes was spotted heading for Express. The destroyer was extremely lucky not to get blown in half right then and there, a swell in the appalling weather carrying her over the torpedoes. All of the main threats having been either eliminated or crippled, Dorsetshire now shifted her fire to the destroyers and light cruisers in the convoy, in particular targeting a Fubuki-class destroyer and a Sendai-class light cruiser. These two vessels were lit on fire in fairly short order, the Megami succumbing to her damage and foundering in the backdrop of the latter half of the engagement. Express also got in on the action with her guns, firing like hell, even whilst the fire burned out for our bow. The destroyer's fire met the forward magazine of an enemy destroyer, which crippled her in an instant. Moments later, said Fubuki succumbed to damage, while the destroyer that Dorsetshire had been originally targeting was also shocked by the detonation of her forward magazines. Unsurprisingly, she too sank in short order as a result. As the Sendai burned down, the next target came in the form of a much older kamikaze-class destroyer that was advancing on Force F. A full broadside from Dorsetshire saw this offensive stop in its tracks, 8-inch shells crippling the old vessel before a 5th magazine detonation split the destroyer in half. By this point, almost all the escorts had been flattened, which left the remaining transports scrambling for their lives. Dorsetshire did a wild circle around these transports while laying into them with 8-inch high explosives, and after several minutes of constant gunnery, all but one ship and convoy had been destroyed, including the first Japanese carrier lost to a method other than an air attack. The invasion convoy that had put troops on Kolkata had been thoroughly destroyed, but that still left the troops themselves, which were quick to overwhelm the garrison stationed there, taking control of the local facilities. The Japanese could not be allowed to maintain a foothold on India proper, and thus every single ship carrier capable of troop or supply transport was retasked from their original objectives and sent to any base that had troops so that they could be ferried to Kolkata. From Force A, Hotspur and Warspite remained by Trincomalee to protect the island of Ceylon, allowing Newcastle, Griffin, Zam and Norman to ferry troops north. Invariably joining them on the same mission were the troop transports New Holland and Orange, Dorsetshire and Express and Force F, and the entirety of Force B. Eventually, even the detached elements of Force F were involved in the defence of Kolkata, as was the supply ship RFA Clan Campbell. Over the next 7 days, 13 warships and 4 merchant vessels carried 8,000 troops and 4,000 tons worth of supplies to the beleaguered garrison, the single largest seaborne movement of personnel to date. But for their efforts, by the 2nd of May, the now reinforced garrison had put the Japanese on the defensive in the area, trapping them in a pocket in the region. A smaller issue now cropped up. In the action that had seen the sinking of Hosho, Force F had burned through almost its entire stock of ammunition and now didn't even have enough ammo to get through a single battle. Consequently, they were sent to Colombo to rearm, leaving Force B to defend the area, but now there was a lack of blanket security in the northern region. More aircraft were sent out on scouting duty immediately east of India. Luckily, the lapse in security didn't see any further landings in the region, and Force F returned on the 5th of May, freshly restocked. There was, however, still a need for extra warships to man the line, especially in the waters around northern India. With the command point allocation available, there were two main options available. A slow but individually powerful force based on one of the R-class battleships, or a more mobile force centered on the only remaining carrier still operational on the feeder. HMS Hermes and HMS Vampire, designated Force K, set out from Colombo, heading for the Bay of Bengal. Once they arrived the following day, Hermes sent out her complement of Fulmar fighters and entered the patrol routine. It didn't take long for the light carrier and her escort to sense blood in the water. Catalina spotted the convoy north of Port Blair, and Force K was sent to intercept. It took most of the following day for them to find said convoy, but once it had been pinned down, Hermes launched her 9 old salvage torpedo bombers to attack. Arriving overhead, in spite of the presence of an armed merchant cruiser, the two targets chosen were a cargo ship and a troop ship. In the resulting attack, 2 torpedo hits were scored in the cargo ship, while the troop ship was walloped by 4. With virtually an entire side torn off, the troop ship sank in short order, but the cargo ship remained afloat for far longer, secondary explosions and a massive fire eventually putting it down. So, Hermes, by this point the second oldest carrier in the Royal Navy, had claimed their first kills in the Indian feeder. But the Japanese fleet carriers Hiryu and Soryu still hadn't reared their ugly heads at the Eastern Fleet, and to say that they severely overmatched Hermes was a hell of an understatement. With that said, there was a vessel in the area that could fight either vessel on a more even footing. This has been the Indian Ocean Campaign for War on the Sea. Stay frosty, folks, and I'll catch you on the next one.